The white envelope sat in the center of the table, like something that had already been decided. I noticed it the moment the hostess led us to our seats, a round table near the window, 8 floors above downtown Denver, the kind of restaurant where the menus have no prices and the candles are replaced before they burn halfway down. Christmas Eve. Outside, snow was falling in slow, unhurried sheets against the glass. Inside, everything was warm and deliberate and arranged. I was wearing the blue Oxford shirt I'd had since 2009. The collar was beginning to separate at one corner. I'd pressed it that morning anyway. Ethan sat across from me. He had on a jacket that probably cost more than my first truck. He was talking to his mother, Margaret, about a deal he'd closed in October, something about a portfolio restructuring, a number with 7 figures in it. Margaret was nodding the way people nod when they've already heard the story, but enjoy the telling. Claire sat to my left. She was wearing a green dress she'd bought herself, and she'd put her hair up the way her mother used to. I noticed that. I didn't say anything. Thomas sat to my right. He was the one I watched most. In those first minutes, he was 68 years old, with the careful posture of a man who had learned, over a long time, to take up exactly as much space as necessary and no more. He hadn't looked at the envelope yet, or if he had, he'd already finished looking. Ethan reached for his water glass, and his eyes moved to the envelope, and then to me, and he smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed the outcome of the evening had already been settled. I've seen that smile before in contract negotiations, in courtrooms, once across a conference table in a bankruptcy proceeding that had my name on the filing. I know what that smile costs. And I know what it costs when it turns out to be wrong. Claire looked at the envelope, then she looked at me, then at Ethan. Something shifted in her expression, not quite fear, not quite understanding, something in between, under the table. I found her hand and held it. She didn't pull away. She didn't say anything either. We sat like that for a moment, her hand in mine, the snow falling outside, the envelope between us. Thomas turned his water glass a quarter turn. Then he looked at me directly, not at the envelope, not at Ethan, at me. His expression was not readable as fear or contempt or curiosity. It was something older than all of those. It was the expression of a man waiting to see whether another man already knows what he knows. I looked back at him. I didn't nod. I didn't smile. The waiter came and asked if we were ready to order. The last time I filed for bankruptcy, I was 41 years old, and I had $47 in my checking account. The notice came on a Tuesday in October. I remember because the leaves outside the office window were still orange, which seemed wrong, the world too bright for what was happening inside it. My attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who had handled my affairs for 9 years, slid the papers across his desk and said, very quietly, "Richard, I'm sorry." I told him not to be. I signed where he indicated. Then I drove home to tell my wife. Margaret was in the kitchen when I came in. She looked at my face and didn't ask what had happened. She poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of me, and sat down. I told her everything: the creditors, the liens on the equipment, the 3 contracts that had fallen through when the market collapsed, the fact that there was nothing left. Nothing. Not the office on Colfax, not the 2 trucks, not the land we'd been holding in Jefferson County for 4 years waiting for permits. Gone. All of it. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the table for a long moment. Then she said, "Tien cho the mat, nung nan kach ti kong." Money can be lost. Character cannot. She said it simply. The way she said most things that mattered, not as comfort, not as philosophy, just as fact. Then she said something else, something I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count in the years since she died. She said, "If you want to know who someone really is, let them think you have nothing. Character will tell you everything, every single time." I didn't understand it fully then. I thought I did. I was wrong. Thomas Mercer came to work for me in 1997 when my company was 8 years old and growing faster than I could manage alone. He was 33, a year younger than I was, and he'd been running a small subcontracting operation that had just dissolved. He wasn't a brilliant man in the way that gets noticed immediately, but he was steady, and he showed up every morning, every job site, every meeting. I made him site manager within 14 months. He was good at it. He kept crews on schedule and he didn't cut corners, which in this industry is rarer than it sounds. We were friends in the way men become friends through work, not the kind who call each other on a Sunday afternoon, but the kind who trust each other at 6 in the morning on a cold job site when everything has gone wrong and someone has to make a decision. That kind of trust is different. It's built from smaller things. I knew Thomas's wife's name was Margaret too, which we both found funny. I knew his son was born in 2000, that Thomas had driven his wife to the hospital himself because the roads were iced over and he didn't want to wait for an ambulance. I knew he was proud of that, not the driving, but the not waiting. He was that kind of man. Then, in 2006, Thomas came to me with a problem he hadn't told anyone else. He'd made a series of investments that had gone badly, not catastrophically, but badly enough that he was 6 months from losing his house. He was 42 years old, and he sat in my office and told me with the particular stillness of a man who has rehearsed the conversation so many times that all the shame has been worn smooth. He asked if I could help. I told him I could. I wrote him a check for $72,000. I did not draw up a repayment schedule. I did not ask for collateral. I told him to pay it back when he could and to not mention it again. He said he wouldn't forget it. He said that twice. 2 years later, when the 2008 crisis hit and my company went under, Thomas was one of the last to leave. He stayed 4 months after I stopped being able to pay full salaries. He was the one who helped me call the remaining crews and explain what was happening. He shook my hand on the last day in the Colfax office and said, "You'll be back." He meant it. I could tell he meant it. He left Denver shortly after that. I heard he'd moved to Colorado Springs, then to Phoenix, then back to Denver. I heard he'd gotten into financial consulting, that he was doing well, that he'd built something. I was glad. I was genuinely glad because I remembered who he'd been at 6 in the morning on a job site when everything was wrong, and that man deserved to do well. I don't know exactly when he stopped being that man. I don't think it happens in a single moment. I've built and lost enough to know that character doesn't change all at once. It changes the way a building settles slowly, imperceptibly, until one day you notice the door doesn't hang straight anymore and you realize it hasn't hung straight for years. I rebuilt the company in 2010 with a single contract, a drainage project in Adams County that nobody else wanted because the soil conditions were difficult and the timeline was tight. I bid it low, took it, and worked it myself for the first 6 weeks. My hands still carry the evidence of that winter. The scar on my right palm, the one Claire used to trace with her finger when she was small and ask me where it came from. That's from a cable that snapped on the Adams County site on a morning in February when the temperature was 9 degrees, and I was the only one there who knew how to fix it. I fixed it. We finished the project 11 days ahead of schedule. By 2015, the company had 32 employees and 4 active contracts. By 2018, I had cleared every debt from the bankruptcy and set aside enough that I would not need to work again if I chose not to. I chose to continue working. Not because I needed the money, but because I am better at it than I am at anything else. And because the work itself, the reading of soil, the calculation of load, the problem of how to move water away from where it shouldn't be, still interests me in the way it always has. I kept the Honda. I kept the shirts. I still eat at the counter of a diner on Federal Boulevard where the coffee costs $2, and the owner, a man named Ray, has been there since before I went bankrupt and doesn't know or care that I rebuilt. That suits me. Margaret was right about most things, and she was right about this: the way a man carries himself when he thinks no one is watching is the only version of him that's actually true. Thomas's son, Ethan, grew up knowing only that his father had a friend named Richard who worked in construction, an older man, a little weathered, nothing remarkable about him. I know this because Claire told me. in the early months after she and Ethan became serious that Ethan had described me to his friends as Claire's dad, some contractor. She said it without concern. She didn't know yet what it meant. I filed it away the way I file most things quietly, without comment, in a place I can find again when I need it. Thomas never told his son about the $72,000. He never told him about the morning I called the crews. He never told him what my name had meant on a job site in 1999 or what it had cost me to write that check in 2006 or what it had taken to come back from nothing at 43 years old with scar tissue on both hands and a company that existed only because I refused to stop. He let his son believe what was convenient to believe. I understand why. I even, in a way, understand Thomas. A man who has been helped sometimes needs to make the person who helped him smaller in order to live with himself. It's not admirable, but it's human. What I didn't know, sitting in that restaurant on Christmas Eve with the snow falling outside and the envelope on the table between us, what I was still in the process of learning was exactly how small Thomas had made me in his son's mind and how far he had let that smallness go without correction. The waiter was still waiting for us to order. I picked up the menu. My hands were steady. They have always been steady. That's the thing about rebuilding from nothing. It teaches you that most situations are not, in fact, emergencies. You learn to tell the difference. You learn to wait. I first met Ethan Calloway 5 years ago at a birthday party for one of Claire's colleagues, a woman named Dana who worked in urban planning and threw the kind of party where the music was too loud and the food was too good, and everyone ended up staying 2 hours longer than they'd planned. I wasn't supposed to be there. Claire had called me that afternoon and said, "Cha, Dana says you can come if you want," in the voice she uses when she actually wants me to come, but won't ask directly. I drove over in the truck I'd had for 6 years and brought a bottle of scotch that cost more than anyone at that party would have guessed. Ethan was standing near the kitchen doorway when Claire introduced us. He was 29 or 30 at the time, lean in the way young men are lean before life settles into them, with a handshake that was firm without being performative. He asked what I did. When I told him construction project development, mostly commercial, he asked follow-up questions, not polite questions. Real ones. He wanted to know about margins, about subcontractor relationships, about how the 2008 collapse had changed the way developers structured financing. He had done some reading. I could tell the difference between someone who had done some reading and someone who was performing having done some reading. Ethan had actually read. We talked for 40 minutes. Claire drifted in and out of the conversation, which is what she does when she's pleased. She lets things breathe. By the end of the night, Ethan had asked me about 2 contacts I had in commercial lending. I gave him both names. I also gave him my direct number and told him to use it if he had questions. He thanked me in a way that felt genuine. I drove home thinking that Claire had found someone worth watching. Over the next 18 months, I watched. Ethan used both contacts. He called me twice with questions about deal structures, and both times the questions were good. He was promoted once. Then again, moving from an analyst position into something with a title that required a longer business card. Claire was proud of him. I could see it in the way she talked about his work, the small brightness in her voice when she said his name in the context of something he'd accomplished. She loved him the way you love someone whose potential you can see clearly and who seems to be living up to it. The change was subtle at first. That's the thing about this kind of shift. It doesn't arrive all at once. Like weather, it seeps in. The first time I noticed it, we were at dinner, the 3 of us, at a restaurant Claire had chosen in Cherry Creek. Ethan made a comment about a mutual acquaintance, a man named Garrett, who had been a year ahead of him at his firm and had recently left to start his own practice. Ethan said, with a small smile, that Garrett had never really understood how the industry worked. He said it in a way that assumed I would agree. I didn't agree. Garrett was a careful, methodical man who had made a reasonable choice. But I said nothing. I ordered the salmon and changed the subject, and Ethan moved on without noticing that I had redirected him. 3 months later, he told me I should think about replacing my truck. He said it pleasantly. The way you tell someone their shoelace is untied a favor, framed as helpfulness. Richard, he said, using my first name the way he had started doing around the time of his second promotion. You should really look at upgrading that vehicle. First impressions matter in this industry. I told him the truck ran fine. He smiled in a way that suggested he found my response quaint. In March, a Tuesday evening, the kind of cold that comes back to Denver after you've already decided winter is over, the three of us had dinner at a place in Rhino that Ethan had chosen. He had a colleague with him, a man named Prescott, who worked in the same fund and wore the kind of watch that requires a conversation to explain. Ethan introduced me as Claire's dad, retired contractor, before I had sat down. Prescott nodded the way people nod when they've already categorized you and moved on. I ordered the steak. Ethan spent 20 minutes walking Prescott through a deal structure, then turned to me and said, with the particular warmth of a man, including someone in a conversation he knows they can't follow, "You probably don't track this stuff, Richard, but the carry structure on this one is really something." Prescott laughed. Claire looked at her water glass. I cut my steak and said nothing. I have found, over many years, that the people who explain things to you that you already understand are telling you something more useful than the explanation itself. I filed it away. He said it pleasantly. The way you tell someone their shoelace is untied a favor, framed as helpfulness. Richard, I said, using my first name the way he had started doing around the time of his second promotion, you should really look at upgrading that vehicle. First impressions matter in this industry. I told him the truck ran fine. He smiled in a way that suggested he found my response quaint. After that, the comments came with more regularity. The truck, the jacket I wore to a company function, a brown corduroy I'd had for 11 years that Claire had given me for my birthday when she was still in graduate school. You should wear something better. Richard. People notice. Once, at a family dinner, he looked at the glass of house wine I'd ordered and said, loud enough for the table to hear, "With your retirement income, I'm honestly not sure how you manage." He laughed after he said it. His mother, Margaret, smiled. Claire looked at her plate. In August, there was a barbecue at Thomas and Margaret's house in Highlands Ranch, a Sunday afternoon, the kind of late summer day that makes Denver generous and easy. There were perhaps 15 people there, neighbors, a couple of Thomas's business contacts, Claire's friend Dana and her husband. Ethan was in the middle of the yard when I arrived, holding a beer and talking to two men I didn't recognize. He saw me come through the gate and called across the yard, "Richard, come settle something for us." I walked over. He put his arm around my shoulder, the gesture of a man who is about to use you, and said to the two men, "This is Claire's dad. He did construction work for years. Richard, we were just debating whether a guy can really make a living in the trades anymore, or whether that's basically a dead end." He said it without malice. That was the thing about Ethan. He never said the cruelest things with malice. He said them with the breezy confidence of a man who has never had to consider what the words cost. One of the two men, someone named Garrett, who turned out to be a former colleague of Ethan's, looked at me with the polite blankness of someone waiting for me to confirm that I was. In fact, an example of the dead end under discussion. I looked at Ethan. I said, "A man can make a living at anything he's willing to do well." Then I went inside and found Thomas in the kitchen. He was slicing tomatoes. He didn't look up when I came in. He said, "I heard that." I said, "I know." We stood there for a moment without speaking. Then he handed me a plate and said, "Tomatoes are from the garden." That was all. But I saw his jaw, and I knew that Thomas was carrying something he hadn't yet decided how to put down. I did not correct him. I did not explain. I have been in rooms with men who had far more leverage than Ethan Calloway and far more reason to use it, and I have learned that the moment you begin explaining yourself to someone who has already decided what you are worth, you have already lost the exchange. The explanation becomes evidence of exactly the weakness they assumed. So I smiled. I ordered another glass of the house wine. I let him talk. But I was watching. Claire came to me one Sunday afternoon in October. She drove out to the house in Evergreen, which she only does when something is sitting with her that she hasn't been able to put down. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug of coffee she wasn't drinking and said, "Cha, Ethan's not the same as he was. She didn't say it like a complaint. She said it like a question she'd been turning over and couldn't answer. She had told me something different in the spring-April, I think. A phone call on a Wednesday evening when I was still at the office. She had said, carefully, that she thought I was being too hard on Ethan, that he was still finding his footing, that the comments about the truck and the jacket were just his way of wanting things to be good for us, for the family. She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed slightly, and I had listened without interrupting. And when she finished, I told her she was probably right. She sounded relieved. I understood, then, that she had needed me to say that not because she believed it fully, but because believing it was easier than the alternative. I did not take that from her. It wasn't time yet. But I remembered the call, and I remembered the particular care in her voice, and I understood that Claire had been working very hard for a long time to make the story come out a different way than it was going. I sat down across from her. I looked at her face, the same face I'd watched change from a child's face to a woman's over 32 years, the same face that had her mother's patience and her mother's way of going quiet when something mattered. I said, people change when they forget that they once needed other people. She looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded, very slowly, and drank her coffee. She didn't ask me what I meant. She already knew. That was the thing about Claire. She understood more than she said, and she said more than most people heard. What she was telling me, without saying it directly, was that she was starting to see the architecture of the man she had married, not just the surface of him, which was polished and confident and easy to admire, but the load-bearing walls underneath, and whether they would hold. I thought about the young man who had stood in Dana's kitchen doorway 5 years earlier, asking real questions, writing down the names of 2 contacts I'd offered, calling me twice with problems he had actually tried to solve before picking up the phone. That man had known he needed things. He had known he was still building. And then, somewhere between the second promotion and the longer business card and the dinners where he ordered for the table without asking, he had forgotten where he came from. Not the neighborhood or the income bracket, those things he remembered perfectly well, and they embarrassed him. What he had forgotten was the posture of a person who understands that what they have was built on the foundation of what others gave them. I didn't say any of this to Claire. I refilled her coffee. We talked about other things, a project I was finishing in Lakewood, a trip she was thinking about taking in the spring. When she left, she hugged me at the door for a moment longer than usual. I stood on the porch and watched her car go down the drive. The aspens had already gone bare. The sky was the particular gray that comes to Denver in late October, flat and close, the kind of sky that makes everything underneath it look very small and very clear at the same time. I went back inside. I had some calls to make. 2 weeks later, Claire called on a Tuesday evening. I was at my desk going over material estimates for the Lakewood project. Concrete pricing had shifted again, and I wanted the numbers right before the subcontractor meeting Thursday morning. I picked up on the second ring. "Dad," she said, "Ethan's parents want to do a family Christmas dinner, all of us together." A pause. "Are you okay with that?" I set down my pencil. "Of course," I said. She sounded relieved in the way people sound when they've been holding a question for longer than they let on. We talked for a few more minutes about logistics, a restaurant downtown, December 23rd, 7 o'clock. She said Ethan was making the reservation. I told her that sounded fine. After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a while without picking the pencil back up. I knew something was coming. I'd known it since October, since the afternoon Claire sat at my kitchen table and told me about the prenuptial discussion without quite telling me. There are things people don't say directly that they say completely. I'd spent enough years in negotiation rooms with contractors, with lenders, with city inspectors who had made up their minds before they walked through the door to know the difference between a conversation and a preparation for something else. I called David Chen the next morning. David and I had gone to the University of Colorado together back when neither of us had anything worth protecting. He was an attorney now, estate and contract law, An office on the 16th floor of a building I had done structural consulting on 12 years ago. We had lunch twice a year and talked on the phone more than that. He was one of the few people who knew the full picture of what I had built and exactly how it was structured. "I need you on standby," I told him. "December 23rd, family dinner. I don't know exactly what's coming, but I want you available if something needs to move quickly." David didn't ask unnecessary questions. That was one of the things I appreciated about him. He said, "I'll keep the evening clear. Call me from the parking lot if you need to." I told him I would. The week before Christmas, I went to my closet and took out the jacket. It was a barn coat, dark green canvas, the kind of thing I had worn on job sites for years. The right cuff had a paint stain from a renovation project in 2019 that had never fully come out. The lining was warm and the zipper worked, and there was nothing wrong with it. I had 3 suits in that same closet, 2 of them purchased in the last 4 years, and a dress coat that Claire had given me 2 birthdays ago. I left all of them where they were. I want to be clear about something. I was not performing poverty. I was not trying to prove a point with a costume. The jacket was simply what it was, a thing I had owned and used and kept because it served its purpose. If Ethan looked at it and drew conclusions, those conclusions would be his own. I had learned a long time ago, during the years when I actually had nothing, that the people who judge a man by what he wears are telling you something important about how they calculate worth. I was content to let Ethan tell me. I drove west on Colfax toward downtown just before 6:30. The city was strung with lights, the kind of December evening that makes Denver look like it's trying hard to be somewhere else. I merged onto Spear and called Thomas. He picked up after 3 rings. I could hear voices in the background, Margaret's, I thought, and maybe Ethan's. "Thomas," I said, "I'll be there at 7. Thank you for the invitation." There was a pause, not a long one, but the kind that has weight. "Richard." Another pause. I need to speak with you. After dinner, if that's all right." I watched the lights on Larimer Street pass through my windshield. "Of course," I said. I didn't ask him what it was about. I already had a sense. The way you develop a sense for structural problems after enough years not seeing the crack yet, but feeling the particular stillness in a wall that means something behind it has shifted. Thomas had worked for me for 6 years before he started his own firm. He knew things about how I operated that Ethan had never thought to ask. I found parking half a block from the restaurant, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment. The street outside was busy with last-minute shoppers, people moving fast with their coats pulled close. I checked the time, 6:52. I got out of the car, buttoned the barn coat against the cold, and walked toward the entrance. The restaurant was called Ardent. I had passed it twice before without going in the kind of place with a hostess stand visible through the glass and no prices on the menu posted outside. The door was heavy brass-handled oak, and it opened with the particular silence of well-maintained hinges. Inside, the air was warm and carried the smell of cedar candles and something roasting. A hostess in black smiled at me and asked for the name on the reservation. "Callaway," I said. "I'm with that party." She led me through the main dining room. The tables were set with white linen and small arrangements of pine boughs and cream-colored candles. It was full, but not loud, the kind of full where people speak in a register that carries the assumption that what they're saying is worth hearing. I followed the hostess toward the private room at the back. They were already seated, Ethan and Claire on one side, Thomas and Margaret on the other, and an empty chair at the end closest to the door. Ethan saw me first. He stood not to greet me, I thought, but because standing gave him a moment to take in the barn coat before I sat down. "Richard," he extended his hand. His grip was firm in the way of a man who has been told that firm handshakes matter. "Glad you made it." Claire stood and came around the table. She hugged me and held on a half-second longer than usual. I patted her back twice and told her she looked well. She did. She also looked tired in the way people look when they have been managing something for a long time. Thomas nodded from across the table. "Richard." His voice was even. Margaret smiled. Richard, so good to see you. We were worried you might have trouble with the drive. I told her the drive was fine, hung the barn coat on the hook near the door, and sat down. The menus were already open. I picked mine up and looked at it. That coat, Ethan said, and paused. He was smiling the pleasant, inclusive smile of a man making an observation he believes the room will enjoy. Richard, you really should upgrade your wardrobe. We come to places like this fairly often now. I looked up from the menu. I looked at him for a moment, not at his expression, but at the line of his jaw, the way his shoulders sat. Then I looked back at the menu. It's a good coat, I said. Of course it is, he laughed and reached for his wine glass. I'm just saying, a man in your position, you could afford something a little sharper. Claire looked at her menu. Thomas looked at his water glass. I ordered the salmon. The food came in courses, and between each one, Ethan talked. He talked about a ski trip to Vail they were planning for February, about a property they were considering in Scottsdale, about a fund he'd moved a significant position into before the last quarter turned. He talked with the particular energy of a man who has recently discovered that money can be discussed as fluently as any other language and is still pleased by his own fluency. Each time he mentioned a figure or a destination, his eyes moved to me briefly, not to include me, but to measure the distance between where he was and where I was. I ate my salmon. It was well prepared. The Scottsdale property is the more interesting play, he said to Thomas. 14 units, cap rate just under 6. We could hold it 3 years and come out well ahead. Thomas said, and cut his steak. The Vail trip is really for Claire. Ethan continued, she's been working hard. She deserves it. He reached over and touched Claire's arm. She smiled, and the smile was real. She did love him. I knew that. Had known it since the first time she'd said his name on the phone 2 years ago, and I'd heard the particular warmth in her voice that meant she wasn't talking about a friend. That part was not in question. Margaret set down her fork and looked at me with the careful expression of a woman who has learned to frame observations as questions. Richard, you never really talk about your work. You manage things, don't you, properties, or some kind of contracting? She said the word manage with a slight softening, the way you soften a word to make it smaller without appearing to. That's right, I said. I manage. It must be comfortable, she said. Steady. It's been steady, I said. Ethan leaned back in his chair. He was on his second glass of wine. Richard, I've always been curious with a pension, or whatever you're drawing on. How does that actually work day to day? He paused. I mean, is Claire helping out at all? There's no shame in it. Families help each other. The table went quiet. Not the pleasant quiet of a natural pause, but the other kind, the kind where everyone is aware of what was just said and is waiting to see what happens next. Claire's hand moved under the table and found mine. I held it for a moment, then set my fork down. No, I said. Claire doesn't help me. I'm fine. Ethan nodded slowly, as though I had confirmed something he'd suspected. That's good. We want to make sure she's not carrying anything she doesn't need to. He looked at Claire. You'd tell me. Right. Ethan, Claire said quietly. I'm asking because I care, he said. I want to know the situation. He looked back at me. No offense, Richard, I just think it's important to be realistic about where people are financially. It's not a character judgment. None taken, I said. He held my gaze for a moment, then smiled again. You know what I admire, that you're comfortable with it. A lot of men your age would be embarrassed, but you're at peace with what you have. He gestured vaguely toward the empty space in front of me. That's something. I picked up my water glass and drank. The thing is, he continued, and I noticed he was now speaking to the table rather than to me, including Thomas and Margaret in what had become a small address. The thing is that ambition is something you either have or you don't. It's not a criticism. Some people want to build, and some people are content to just exist. Both are valid. He paused. I just know I couldn't do it. I couldn't stop at a certain level and say, This is enough. I always need to know what's next." Thomas put his knife down. He did it without sound, setting it parallel to his fork with a precision that seemed deliberate. He did not look up. "That's exactly right," Margaret said to Ethan. "You've always been that way, even as a boy." "Richard," Ethan said, turning back to me with the particular warmth of a man who believes he is being generous, "I don't say any of this to make you feel bad. I say it because I think it's important to be honest in a family. We're family now. And I think if you'd had more support earlier, more of a push, things might have looked different for you." I looked at him. He was 35 years old, and he was telling me what my life might have looked like with more ambition. I thought about the 3 a.m. calls in 1998, the year I sold the truck to make payroll. I thought about the folder in my car. I thought about the phone call I had made that afternoon. "Maybe," I said. "That's actually what I admire about Claire," he said. "She didn't inherit the settling. She pushes. She wants things." He looked at her with genuine affection. "She got that from somewhere else." Claire said very quietly, "Ethan." "I'm complimenting you," he said. Thomas looked up from his plate. He looked at Ethan for a long moment, not with anger, but with the expression of a man reading something he has read before and is reading again to confirm what it says. Then he looked at me. Our eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds. He looked back at his plate. He did not say anything to correct his son. I had not expected him to, not yet. That was not the arrangement. But I saw in his face what I needed to see, that he was still there, still watching, and that he had heard every word. The dessert menus came. Ethan ordered for the table without asking. He was still talking when the candles burned lower and the room grew quieter around us. And I sat in the particular silence of a man who has learned that silence is not the absence of power. It is the place where power waits. I had been mocked for having nothing. I had gone silent. Both of those things were true. What Ethan did not know, what he had no way of knowing, because he had never thought to ask, was that the silence and the nothing were the same instrument, and I had been playing it for a very long time. The white envelope was still in my coat pocket by the door. The evening was not over. The dessert plates were cleared by a young woman whose name tag read Simone. She moved quietly, professionally, the way people do when they've been trained to disappear. I watched her take the last plate from in front of Thomas. He thanked her. Ethan did not. Thomas waited until Simone had moved toward the kitchen. Then he set his napkin on the table, folded it once along its original crease, and stood. He did not tap his glass. He did not clear his throat. He simply stood, and the table went quiet the way tables do when the oldest person in the room decides to speak. "I have something I'd like to address," Thomas said. His voice was measured, deliberate. He had the voice of a man who had learned to speak carefully, not because he was uncertain, but because he had once said the wrong thing and remembered the cost of it. "Ethan, Margaret, and I have prepared a document, something to protect the family going forward." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set a white envelope on the table. It landed without a sound. We thought tonight was the right occasion. The envelope was letter-sized, sealed, with no writing on the outside. Claire looked at it, then at her father, at me. I kept my eyes on Thomas. Ethan picked up the envelope before anyone else could speak. He opened it with the practiced ease of a man who opens envelopes for a living, clean, efficient, no hesitation. He unfolded the document inside, scanned the first page, and I watched his expression settle into something I recognized: satisfaction, the particular satisfaction of a man who believes the outcome has already been decided. "It's a prenuptial agreement," Ethan said. He said it the way a person announces something obvious. He set the document on the table between himself and Claire, smoothed the top page with his palm, and looked across at me. "Standard language. Our attorneys drafted it. It protects our assets, the portfolio, the property in Aspen, the accounts we've built." He paused. "Nothing personal. Richard, that's just business. You understand how these things work." Claire had gone very still beside him. "Ethan," she said quietly. "Claire, this is a practical matter." He didn't look at her when he said it. He was still looking at me. "Your father's a reasonable man. He'll understand." Thomas sat back down. He folded his hands on the table. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize, not triumphant, not apologetic, something more careful than either. He was waiting for something. I didn't yet know what. Margaret reached for her water glass. She didn't drink from it. She just held it. "The agreement protects both parties," Ethan continued. He slid the document slightly toward my side of the table, not far enough for me to reach without leaning forward, but far enough to make the gesture clear. "I want to be transparent about this. No surprises. We're asking Claire to sign. And obviously we'd want your acknowledgement as well." He paused. That pause was deliberate. A premarital agreement is just good financial planning. I'm sure you of all people understand the value of protecting what you've built. He smiled when he said it. "A person like you." He hadn't used those exact words, yet he was working toward them. The way a man works toward a punchline he's been rehearsing. "Richard." His voice dropped just enough to carry the weight he intended. "I hope you don't take this the wrong way. We know your situation is different from ours. That's not a judgment. It's just reality. A person like you has worked hard, I'm sure, but we have obligations to protect. You understand that, don't you? A person like you." There it was. Claire made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I looked at her. Her eyes were bright in the candlelight, and not from the candles. Her jaw was set in the way it had been set since she was 9 years old, and trying not to cry in front of someone she didn't want to cry in front of. She was looking at the tablecloth. Her hands were in her lap, beneath the table, where no one could see them. I had seen her sit like that once before at her mother's funeral, in the third pew, when she was 24 years old and the world had just changed shape permanently. She had not cried in the church. She had cried in the car, on the way home, with her head against the window, and I had driven and said nothing because there was nothing to say. That was the only time in my life I had wished I were a different kind of man, the kind who could fill silence with something useful. I was not that kind of man. I never had been. Margaret set her water glass down. She looked at the table, not at me, not at Claire, not at Ethan at the table, at the white linen, at some fixed point that required no response from her. Thomas was still watching me. He had not smiled when Ethan said "a person like you." He had not nodded. He had not shifted in his chair or reached for his wine. He had simply watched, with the expression of a man who is waiting for something he expects to arrive and is not certain whether he wants it to. I looked at the document on the table. 12 pages from what I could see. The law firm's name was printed at the top, a Denver firm I recognized. Good attorneys. Thorough work. I looked at Ethan. He was still smiling. He had the smile of a man who has just played what he believes is the final card in a hand he's already won. "May I read it?" I said. My voice was the same as it had been all evening. Ethan blinked just slightly, just once, as if he had expected something different. Anger, perhaps, or deflation, or the particular fumbling of a man who has just been reminded of his place. "Of course," he said. "Take your time." I pulled the document toward me. I turned to the first page. The candles had burned down another quarter-inch since Thomas had stood. The restaurant had grown quieter around us, the way restaurants do late in the evening when the other tables have settled into coffee and low conversation. I read the first page slowly. I did not hurry. I had learned, a long time ago, that the pace at which a man reads a document tells the other people in the room everything they need to know about whether he understands it. Thomas had not looked away from me since I reached for the pages. His hands were still folded on the table. He was the stillest person in the room. I turned to the second page. I read the second page the same way I had read the first line by line, not skimming. The prenuptial agreement was 12 pages. Someone had paid a good attorney to draft it. The language was precise in some places and deliberately vague in others, which told me something about the intention behind it. Precise where it needed to protect Ethan's existing assets. vague where it described what would constitute Claire's contribution to the marriage. I had seen documents like this before, not in family law, but in contract disputes, the kind of language that sounds neutral until you need to invoke it, and then it means exactly what the person who wrote it wanted it to mean. I turned to the third page. Ethan had stopped touching his wine glass. He was watching me the way a man watches a door he expects to open at any moment. His mother, Margaret, had her hands folded in her lap. She had not spoken since the envelope had been produced. Claire was looking at the table. I turned to the fourth page. The candle between Thomas and me had burned down to the point where the wax was pooling around the base. A server passed our table, glanced at the unlit conversation, and kept walking. The piano in the far corner of the restaurant had stopped sometime in the last few minutes. I hadn't noticed exactly when. I read through the asset disclosure section. I read through the clause that addressed what would happen in the event of separation within the first 5 years. I read the clause that addressed the second 5 years. I read the definition of marital assets, and the definition of pre-existing assets, and the definition of professional earnings, all 12 pages. Then I set the document down on the table in front of me. I placed it squarely, aligned with the edge of the tablecloth. I picked up the pen that Ethan's attorney had left beside the envelope. I held it for a moment. Then I set it down. I looked at Ethan. "I need to think about this," I said. That was all I said. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before it. The earlier silences had been uncomfortable, the kind that made people fill them with words. This one had weight. It settled over the table like something physical. Ethan's jaw tightened. "But Richard," Thomas said, "let me speak with my son for a moment." He said it quietly, without looking at Ethan. He was still looking at me when he said it. He held my gaze for 1 second longer, and in that second I understood that whatever Thomas was about to say to his son, he had been carrying it for a long time and had been waiting for the right moment to set it down. Thomas pushed his chair back from the table. He stood, straightened his jacket, the same careful gesture he'd had for as long as I'd known him, and placed one hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder. Not warmly, firmly. The way you place a hand on someone's shoulder when you're telling them to stand up and come with you. Ethan stood. He looked confused. He looked at his mother, who gave him nothing. He looked at Claire, who was still looking at the table. He followed his father. I watched them cross the restaurant. Thomas chose a corner near the window, away from the remaining occupied tables, where the low light from the street came through the glass and made everything look slightly removed from the rest of the room. Thomas stood with his back partly to the room. Ethan stood facing him. I did not watch them after that. I looked at the candle. Claire reached across the table and touched the edge of the document. She didn't pick it up. She just touched it, the way you touch something you're not sure you want to read. I didn't say anything. Margaret lifted her water glass and set it back down without drinking. In the corner by the window, Thomas went silent for a long time. I knew that silence. I'd used it myself, in conference rooms and on job sites, and once in a lawyer's office in 2009 when the other side had come in confident and left uncertain. Silence, when used correctly, is not the absence of something. It is a thing in itself. It has pressure. It has direction. Thomas had learned that, somewhere along the way. Or perhaps he had always known it, and I had simply never seen him use it until now. Ethan's posture changed first. His shoulders came down from where they'd been sitting, up near his ears, and dropped into something that looked less like confidence and more like a man waiting to be told something he doesn't want to hear. Then Thomas leaned in and said something. I could not hear the words from where I was sitting. I was not meant to, but I watched Ethan's face, and I saw the moment the words landed. Thomas had told me once, years ago, what had happened in the fall of 2008. He had come to my office on a Tuesday morning without an appointment, which was unlike him. Thomas had always been precise about appointments. He sat across from my desk and told me that his business had failed, not struggling, not difficult, failed. He had lost the account that made up 60% of his revenue in the same month that his line of credit was called in. He had a family. He had a mortgage. He had, he said, no good options left. I had listened to the whole thing before I said anything. When he finished, I asked him how much he needed to get through the next 18 months. He told me. I wrote him a check that afternoon. No interest, no repayment schedule, no document, just a check and a handshake, and the understanding that he would pay it back when he could, and if he couldn't, we would never speak of it again. He paid it back in full, with a note, in 2011. The note was 3 sentences. I still have it somewhere in my desk at home, in the same drawer where I keep my wife's letters. Thomas had never spoken of it to anyone. As far as I knew, I had never spoken of it to anyone. It was the kind of thing that stays between two people, not because it is shameful, but because it belongs to them and no one else. Standing in that corner of the restaurant, Thomas was speaking of it now. I watched Ethan's face go through several things in the space of about 30 seconds. The first was confusion, the particular confusion of a man who is being told something that doesn't fit the story he has been telling himself. Then something harder, something that sat behind his eyes and didn't move. Then, very briefly, something that looked almost like a young man's face, younger than 35, younger than the person who had sat at this table for the last 2 hours before the older, more guarded expression came back and covered it. Thomas was still talking. He was not raising his voice. He never raised his voice. In all the years I'd known him. He leaned slightly closer to his son and said something else, and I watched Ethan's hand come up and press flat against the wall beside the window, as if he needed something to hold on to. I looked away. Then I looked at the candle, which had burned down to almost nothing, and I thought about the drive home and whether the roads would be icy by now. It was that kind of December in Denver, warm enough during the day that you forgot, cold enough at night that the roads turned without warning. Claire said very quietly, "Dad." I looked at her. She had picked up the document. She was holding it with both hands, not reading it, just holding it. Her eyes were wet, but she hadn't cried. She said, "How long have you known this was coming?" "A while," I said. She set the document back down. "Why didn't you say anything?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about her mother, who had always known the difference between the things you say and the things you let people discover for themselves. I thought about what it would have meant to tell Claire 6 months ago or a year ago, what I had noticed and what I had prepared for, what it would have cost her, what it would have changed. "Because it wasn't time yet," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded. The way you nod when you understand something you wish you didn't have to understand. Thomas and Ethan came back to the table. Ethan sat down. He did not look at his mother. He did not look at the document. He looked at his water glass, and then at the tablecloth, and then, finally, at me. His face was different from the face he'd been wearing all evening. The performance had gone out of it. What was left was harder to look at, not because it was ugly, but because it was real. Thomas sat down. He picked up his napkin and placed it back in his lap with the same deliberate care he brought to everything. Then he looked across the table at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply looked at me and gave one small nod, the kind of nod that means I have done what I could. The rest is yours. I held his gaze for a moment. Then I looked down at my coffee cup, which had been empty for a long time. Ethan said, "Richard." His voice was different. The ease had gone out of it. He stopped. He started again. "I didn't know." 3 words. The same 3 words that cover 1,000 different failures. And sometimes, if a person means them fully, they are the beginning of something worth keeping. I didn't answer right away. I've learned that silence, in moments like this, is not unkind. It gives a person time to hear what they've just said and decide whether they mean it. Ethan sat with those 3 words for several seconds. His hands were flat on the table. He wasn't reaching for anything. "I know you didn't," I said finally. I picked up the document from the table. I squared the pages against my palm, slid them back into the envelope, and set it beside Ethan's place setting. I did not sign it. I did not hand it back to his attorney. I simply returned it to the person who had brought it, without ceremony and without explanation, and let that speak for itself. The candle went out on its own sometime in the next minute. The wax had simply run out. No one moved to relight it. Ethan came back to the table slowly. He didn't sit down right away. He stood behind his chair with both hands on the back of it, the way a man stands when he's not sure whether he's staying or leaving. His attorney had already gathered the envelope from the table and was sliding it into his briefcase without making eye contact with anyone. The room was quiet in a way that Christmas rooms are not usually quiet. The servers had retreated to the far side of the restaurant. The table next to ours had fallen into a low murmur, the kind that happens when strangers sense they are witnessing something private and can't quite look away. Ethan looked at me. Then he looked at Claire. I continued eating my dessert. It was a chocolate torte with a dusting of powdered sugar that had been served before any of this started, and it was still good, and I saw no reason to let it go to waste. I took another bite. I could feel Ethan watching me. I did not look up. Claire was crying, not loudly. She wasn't a woman who cried loudly, and I had known her for 32 years. She had her napkin pressed to her mouth, and her eyes were fixed on the tablecloth. It wasn't grief. I knew her well enough to know that. It was shame. The particular kind of shame that comes not from what you've done yourself, but from watching someone you love do something you can't undo for them. I reached across and put my hand over hers. She was cold. "Sweetheart," I said. "It's all right. He'll understand." She looked at me then. Her eyes were red. She said quietly, "Dad, I'm sorry." I squeezed her hand once and let it go. That was enough. At the other end of the table, Margaret was looking at Thomas. Not the way a wife looks at a husband who has made a mistake. The way a woman looks at someone who has chosen a side she didn't expect. Thomas was sitting with his arms folded, his gaze on the table in front of him, and he did not return her look. I had known Thomas for more than 30 years, long enough to know that he had been waiting a long time to be the kind of man who could do what he had just done. His hands were still. Margaret's were not. Ethan finally sat down. He pulled his chair in carefully, as if sudden noise might break something. He looked at his water glass for a moment, then at me. "Richard," he said, I didn't know." I set my fork down. I looked at him directly, which was the first time I had looked at him directly since he'd started talking an hour ago. "I know you didn't," I said. That was the problem. He didn't have an answer for that. I didn't expect one. I let the silence sit between us for a moment, not to punish him, but because silence, when it's earned, is more honest than anything else you can offer a person. Then I picked up the envelope from where his attorney had left it beside my plate. I opened it. I took the document out, unfolded it, and read the last page again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted Ethan to watch me read it. I wanted him to see that I was not afraid of it. When I was finished, I took the pen from my jacket pocket, the same one I'd used to sign the original Walker Construction Incorporation papers in 1987, though I didn't tell him that, and I signed the last page. Beside my signature, in the margin, I wrote 7 words and a number. I folded the document, returned it to the envelope, and slid it across the table to Ethan. "I'll sign it," I said. "Not because I'm afraid of losing anything, because I want Claire protected from a man I'm not yet certain I can trust." Ethan took the envelope. He opened it slowly, the way you open something when you're not sure you want to see what's inside. He unfolded the last page. He found the signature, and then he found the note I had written beside it. "I signed this to protect Claire, not because I am afraid. Our Walker, founder, Walker Construction Group, sold 2023 $47 million. He read it once. Then he read it again. I watched his face the way I used to watch a structural calculation when I knew there was an error somewhere and I was waiting for the number that would reveal it. The color left his face in stages, first from around his mouth, then from his forehead. At the table beside ours, close enough that the linen corners nearly touched, sat 2 men in their late 40s who had been there when we arrived and had been conducting what sounded like a quiet business dinner of their own. I had noticed them earlier in the evening, one with a leather portfolio open beside his plate, the other with the particular posture of someone who negotiates for a living. I did not know them. But I had seen the one with the portfolio glance over twice during the evening, once when Ethan's voice had risen slightly on the word pension, and once when Thomas had stood to speak. Now, in the silence that followed Ethan's reading, the man with the portfolio looked up from his own conversation. He looked at Ethan's face. He looked at the document in Ethan's hands. Then he looked at me briefly. The way a person looks when they have just understood something and looked away. He said something quiet to his companion. His companion turned and looked at our table once, then back. Neither of them said anything to us. They didn't need to. I have been in enough rooms to know when strangers understand what they've just witnessed. The man with the portfolio picked up his wine glass and set it back down without drinking. That was enough. His jaw was still set the way it had been all evening, but the certainty behind it was gone. What was left was something younger and less composed. Thomas was watching his son. He hadn't moved since he sat back down. His expression was not unkind. It was the expression of a man who loves someone and is watching them receive information they should have had a long time ago. Margaret put her glass down without drinking from it. Claire looked at the document in Ethan's hands. She looked at me. I gave her nothing, no nod, no signal. I just picked up my fork and finished the last of the tort. The powdered sugar had mostly dissolved by then, but the chocolate was still good. Ethan set the document on the table. He pressed his hands flat against the cloth, the same way he had after Thomas whispered to him. He was a man who, when the world stopped making sense, needed to feel something solid beneath his palms. I didn't know, he said again, quieter this time. Not an excuse, something closer to an accounting. No, I said, you didn't. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. The restaurant had grown louder again, other conversations resuming, the ordinary sounds of a Christmas evening filling back in around us. The candle was still out. No one had relighted it. Ethan looked at his father. Thomas met his eyes and said nothing. That silence between them was its own conversation, and it was not mine to hear. Claire reached under the table and took my hand. She held it for a moment without speaking. I let her outside, through the window. The snow was still coming down over Denver, the same slow, indifferent snow that had been falling when I arrived, and that would still be falling long after we had all driven home. The dinner ended without ceremony. There was no dramatic exit, no raised voices, no final pronouncement. People simply stopped eating. Margaret gathered her purse. Ethan's colleague, the one who had laughed earliest and loudest, excused himself with a vague reference to another engagement. The waiter came and went twice without anyone ordering dessert. By 8:15, the table that had held 9 people held 2. Claire and I sat across from each other in the wreckage of the evening. The plates had been cleared. Someone had brought water neither of us had asked for. The snow outside the window was thicker now. The street below gone soft and white and quiet. She looked at me for a long time before she spoke. "Dad," she said finally, "why didn't you say something sooner? Any of it. The company. The contracts. Thomas. Why did you let it go this far?" I thought about the answer before I gave it. I've learned that the answers you think about are the ones worth saying. Because if I had said it, I told her, you wouldn't have seen it. You would have heard my version of what happened. You would have had to decide whether to believe me or believe him. That's not a fair position to put a daughter in. I turned my water glass once on the table. But tonight, you watched it happen. You didn't hear it from me. You saw it with your own eyes what he thought of me, and what that meant about what he thought of you. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the candle still unlit and then back at me. I saw her working through something, the way she used to work through math problems at the kitchen table when she was 9 years old, her jaw set, her eyes moving slightly as though reading something no one else could see. "I knew something was wrong," she said quietly. "I just didn't want to know what it was." "I know," I said. "That's different from not knowing. That takes more courage to admit." We left the restaurant at 8:40. I held the door for her. I did not look back at the table, or at the room, or at the window where the snow had been falling. There was nothing left there that required my attention. The drive home took longer than usual. Denver in December, the roads slow and careful. Claire followed me in her own car as far as my street, then pulled alongside and rolled down her window. She said she'd call tomorrow. I told her I'd be home. I watched her taillights disappear around the corner, then went inside and made tea I didn't drink. Ethan called 3 weeks later. A Tuesday afternoon, early January, the kind of gray day that makes Denver look like a different city. I was at my desk reviewing subcontractor bids when my phone lit up with his name. I let it ring once more than I needed to, then answered. He said he was sorry. He said it twice, actually the second time slower, as though he wanted to make sure I understood he meant it. He told me he'd spoken with his father. He didn't say what Thomas had told him, and I didn't ask. Some conversations belong to the people who have them. When he finished, I said, "Ethan, I'm not angry with you." There was a pause. He hadn't expected that. "I'm not angry," I said again. "I'm disappointed in a specific way, not because of what you said about me, but because of what it revealed about what you believe. You looked at my coat and my car and my silence, and you decided you knew exactly what I was worth. And the thing is, a man who does that to his father-in-law will eventually do it to his wife. That's the part that concerns me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't think about it that way." "I know," I said. "That's what I mean." I told him that character is the only thing that tells you who a person actually is. Not their address, not their watch, not the restaurant they choose for Christmas dinner. I told him I'd learned that the hard way. In my 40s. Sitting in a bankruptcy attorney's office with 17 employees who needed paychecks I couldn't sign. I told him the man who helped me survive that period, the one who lent me credibility when I had nothing else, was his father, and that his father had never once, in 30 years, mentioned it publicly. Not once. "Your father understands something you're still learning," I said, "that the quietest people in the room are usually the ones who know the most." He didn't have much to say after that. We ended the call without warmth, but without hostility. I set the phone down and went back to the bids. Over the next 6 months, I watched Ethan the way I watch a building that has been through a hard winter, not expecting transformation, just looking for evidence of whether the structure held. Some things were small. In February, he drove out to Evergreen on a Saturday with Claire unannounced, which was unlike him, and spent 2 hours helping me clear brush from the back slope. He didn't mention the dinner. He didn't explain why he'd come. He just worked, steadily, without talking much, and when we finished, he accepted the coffee I offered and sat at the kitchen table and asked me, genuinely, how the Lakewood project had gone. Not a polite question, a real one, I told him. He listened the way he had listened at Dana's party 5 years earlier, before the promotions and the longer business card. I noticed that. I didn't say anything about it. In April, Claire told me that Ethan had asked his father to have lunch, just the two of them. She said Thomas had called her afterward and told her it had gone well, and that his voice, when he said it, had sounded like a man setting down something heavy. I don't know what they said to each other. I didn't ask. Some repairs happen in private, and the only evidence is that the door hangs straight again. In May, I ran into Prescott Ethan's colleague from the Rhino dinner at a function for a commercial development project in Lodo. He recognized me before I recognized him. He shook my hand and said, "Richard Walker, Ethan mentioned you." He paused. "He said you built Walker Construction Group, that you sold it last year." There was something in his voice that hadn't been there in February at the restaurant, a recalibration, careful and slightly embarrassed. I told him it had been a good run. He said he'd heard. I believed him. Ethan had told him. That was the detail I kept. The following spring, I signed the incorporation papers for a new entity, not a construction company this time, a foundation. The name was Margaret's idea. Technically, though she had been gone for 6 years by then, she had said it once, offhand, during a drive back from a job site in Pueblo. When you're done building other people's buildings, build something that builds people. I had written it on a notepad and kept the notepad in my desk drawer for 6 years without knowing what to do with it. The Foundation's first program placed 11 young tradespeople ages 19 to 24, most of them without college degrees and without connections, into paid apprenticeships with vetted construction firms across Colorado. I drove to the orientation in the Honda. I wore the gray shirt. One of the 11, a 20-year-old named Danny from Aurora, shook my hand and said he'd heard I'd started my own company from nothing twice. He asked if that was true. I told him once was enough to learn the lesson. Twice just confirmed it. He laughed. I liked him immediately. I've thought about that Christmas dinner many times since. Not with anger. The anger was never really mine to hold. I think about the candle that no one relit, and the snow on the window, and the way Thomas sat very still in his chair after he whispered to his son. I think about what it takes to be the quietest person in a room full of noise. I think about my wife, and what she would have said, and whether she would have approved of how I handled it. I think she would have said that the point was never to win. The point was to make sure Claire could see clearly, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a father can do is say nothing at all and trust that the truth is already in the room, waiting for the right moment to be seen. I drove home that night on roads I've known for 34 years. The snow was still falling. I didn't hurry. If you've ever sat quietly at a table where someone counted you as nothing, you already understand why silence can be the most precise thing a man carries, not because it hides weakness, but because it holds everything the other person hasn't thought to look for yet. These stories don't come from nowhere. If they find something true in you, I'll be here.